Why, good day. And it is not as fine a day as I'd like to see out on the prairie. It's a bit dreary today, but I hope you all are well. I'm just here in my parlor and just about to take some tea, if you'd like to join me. I do have quite a bit of things to say about living in Prairie Town, so feel free to ask some questions if you'd like. And let's see. Well, I'm just going to take up some knitting. I've been working on this comforter for a few days now, and I'll be working on it for my eldest son, Thomas. He always gets quite cold in the winter, you see. But I do have quite a lot of time to spare when I'm not working on our farm, and my husband is the blacksmith in Prairie Town, if you did not know that already. And so, good day to you. And I've just been working on my knitting and also getting some things done on the farm. We have 120 acres, and we grow mostly corn, and we do also have hogs and cattle. We do have some geese and chickens as well, but mostly our bread and butter is corn. We can sell it to our neighbors and to folks in Indianapolis as well. I came from Canandaigua, New York originally. So Canandaigua is a fairly large town on the northern end of New York State, and I grew up there. My husband did as well. It's how we met. But what do we have? Mrs. Matthews, yes. 20 acres. 20 acres is what we have improved. We have a total of 120 acres, but most of it is still woodland. We've been improving it the last few years. We've been here since 1833, so 3 years just now. But it does sustain us as a small family. We turn our hogs out into the woodlands, and they feed us quite a bit. And also, we will drive them to City Market in Indianapolis when we need to. Of course, my husband is also a blacksmith, and that's where our primary income comes from. Mr. Curtis is a blacksmith who apprenticed with my father, and his name was Edward Robbins, and he learned the trade from his father. And when my husband decided to become an apprentice, that's how we met, you see. And we share similar philosophies. We do like to have a good discussion about religion. We're Methodists, you see, and in fact, my husband does enjoy being the class officer for our Methodist meetings every Wednesday and every Sunday. So let's see. Oh goodness, I just want to look at what you folks are asking. Oh, do I go back to my hometown often? In Canandaigua, it is oh goodness, about 500 miles away, and so I have not been back since I came here with my family. I came here with my husband, my 4 children, and my sister-in-law, Ruth, and we came just 3 years back. And it took us 33 days to get here. The fact of the matter is that we enjoyed new transportation. You see, we were able to take the Erie Canal to Cleveland, to Buffalo, and then a steam packet to Cleveland, and then we were able to take the Grand Ohio Canal all the way down to Portsmouth, and then from there we had to basically go all the way by foot, and that was the most arduous part of the journey. You see, it took us about 16 days to walk from Cincinnati to Prairie Town, but all in total it only took us about 33 days. Before all the canals, it would have taken perhaps a little over 2 months. So we are blessed in that we live in this new era. But let's see. But because of the fact that it is quite expensive to go to Canandaigua or to Prairie Town, it wasn't really a possibility to come back and forth as much as possible. Although we are trying to save up so that our eldest daughter, Jenny, can perhaps attend academy at Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary. We are very hopeful that we can expand her education. I received an education in Canandaigua through primary school, as well as through some tutors that came by from time to time. I do so love some art, and I learned theorem painting and stenciling and a little bit of embroidery when some tutors came to town, and my father was willing to pay for those folks to help me out. I even joined the singing school in our town, and I hope that my children can do the same as well. I hope that they can receive an education. It's harder out here in Indiana. We just received our first primary school, our first village school, just last year in 1835. So, but I'm hoping that they can essentially gain an education through their schooling, and then perhaps move on. Perhaps even my 2 boys, Thomas and Edward, might even decide to go to college. I know that Thomas was considering perhaps studying Methodism and perhaps going to school for that. So let's see if we have any other questions. Oh, what do I do if my children get sick? My goodness. Well, you see, we don't really rely a lot on traditional medicine, and we do have Dr. Campbell in town, and he is a very good man. But he might employ things like leeches and calomel and things like that. But I do have a kitchen garden, and I learned from my mother how to treat some illnesses. So, for instance, if they get sick and are vomiting, they might receive a tea of peppermint. If they have headaches, they might have a tea of sage, or if sore throats, maybe gargle with sage and a little salt. But we do have various remedies that we can get right here in our own garden. Well, I wanted to invite you all to tea, in fact. So I prepared some tea, and I was just going to pour some. So I'm just going to pour some right into my cup, right here. And of course we get our tea from Mr. Whitaker's store. This is a lovely black souchong tea, and we have folks who come in for the Methodist meeting on Wednesday and on Sunday. We do not have a congregational meeting in a meeting house, so we congregate in our own house till we can raise the funds for a meeting house. And so I am often serving tea and other goods, but I'm just going to pour this tea into my dish. Let it, and you might, I don't know if you can see, but there's quite a lot of grounds, so I'll put those in there. The tea leaves, we don't want to be stuck in our teeth, so I'll let the dish of tea just cool for a minute, and then I will take my tea through the dish. Now, I know that it's becoming a little bit old-fashioned to drink tea in this manner, as there are now some lovely handled teacups. In fact, we do own some that we purchased at Mr. Whitaker's store, but he has some lovely things, but old habits can die hard, as you know. So what I'd like to do, and it's just do that, and I have a little tea plate that I will put my cup just right on. So you're welcome to take tea with me if you'd like. It is it's something that we do at least once a day. Our last meal of the day is sometimes called supper or tea, and we often serve tea with it, especially if guests are due to arrive. And, oh goodness, well, Mr. Mortel, what is my favorite thing to cook? Well, I do love a good roast pork, and we have a tin kitchen, which is an instrument that goes right before the hearth, in which there's a spit, and you put the pork right into it, and it rotates by putting the spit in a little notch every so often. And I love to put a little bit of kitchen pepper on it. You see, kitchen pepper makes a fine gravy. Kitchen pepper is made with cloves, allspice, ginger, mace, nutmeg, and salt and pepper. And you rub that all over the meat and then roast it before the fire. And then you can make a lovely gravy with the drippings. And I do often serve that with applesauce. If I have leftover pork, my favorite pie to bake is pork apple pie, in which you just layer the bits of leftover pork and some apples and a little bit of sugar and salt and pepper, and perhaps a little bit of allspice in it as well. Quite a delicious meal. And we do have things that we serve for holidays. Our favorite holiday in our family is, of course, Independence Day. And in Independence Day, we make a lovely gingerbread. I do so love making Independence cake, which is a lovely fruit cake that has, oh goodness, raisins and currants and wine and spices, and it is baked, and then you can decorate it with some citron and icing or gold leaf. In fact, one time I was making this cake, and I made some citron out of the citron melons that we had grown the previous year, and it was in a little crock, and Edward decided that he was going to help himself to the citron, and I saw him do it, and I said, well, please do not do that anymore. We need the rest for the cake, especially since we're having guests over. Well, unfortunately, young Edward could not help himself, so he decided that he was going to eat all of the citron in one go. And goodness, he had such a stomach ache later. We did have to get out the mint tea, poor child. But he learned his lesson, and we made sure to tell him about greed and how it is, unfortunate that no one would be able to have the citron that year. So our children are quite well behaved usually, but sometimes they can get ahead of themselves, if you know what I mean. Oh, Mrs. Matthews, my tea service. This tea service came with us from Canandaigua. It was a gift from my parents from our wedding, and so it is a little old-fashioned now, but I take it out for special occasions. You might come and visit us, and you might see the newer fashion of spodeware that we purchased from Mr. Whitaker's store, and that is a little bit more fashionable, I'd say. But I do so love the color pink, and This lusterware is something that I am quite fond of. Ah, yes. And, well, thank you, Mr. Mortel. I do so love art. In fact, if you visited our house before, you might notice that the parlor is stenciled. And our parlor back east in Canandaigua was stenciled, which was the fashion at the turn of the 19th century. But and now wall hangings, paper wall hangings, are much more fashionable and are fairly affordable at Mr. Whitaker's store. If you go to Dr. Campbell's house, you can see some lovely wallpaper hangings. But we decided we wanted to stencil our home so that it looked just like our old home, a little piece of home that we could remember. It is hard sometimes thinking that the rest of my family is so far back east. And we do correspond with letters. I do have my brother John back out east, and my husband has his brother Amos, who inherited their family farm, and we do speak from time to time through letters. But it sometimes is sad to think that we've left that behind. But we have built such a lovely community here in Prairie Town. Well, thank you, Ms. Carter. It's very nice to see you as well. Oh, Mrs. Mortel, what will Jenny study if I send her away to school? Well, she does want to study natural philosophy. I did have a tutor that helped me with some natural philosophy as well, mostly in botany. I hear now that they teach astronomy as well, the study of the stars, and that does delight her. But I think that she will most likely learn a language. I did learn a little bit of French, and she might perhaps learn to embroider and draw. And she already does do some very wonderful drawings when she's at home, and she has a little notebook that she does botanical drawings. And I've myself have been tutored in botanical watercolor a little bit. We don't have any watercolors at the moment, but we're saving up so that perhaps we can purchase some from Mr. Whitaker. And, oh yes, I know that Mrs. Campbell would be shocked to see me drinking from my saucer. I know that Dr. and Mrs. Campbell are from a higher society than I am, and this is the tradition that I grew up in. Drinking tea from the saucer is what we grew up in, and even my children sometimes tease me about it, but I will gladly take tea any way that is offered to me, but I certainly do not mind. I think this is a far superior way. The tea leaves, of course, can get stuck in the teeth, and so putting them into the cup first and draining them into the saucer and putting the slops in the bowl means that you won't have as much tea in your teeth, which when folks drink from their teacups, I tend to find that is exactly what I see. And of course I'm not going to point that out because that would be quite rude, but I do feel that there is a purpose to drinking tea the way that I do that is quite sufficient. Oh, Mr. Mortel, how do I discipline my children? Well, I, we don't take a terribly firm hand the way that some folks do, but sometimes, well, for instance, about a month back, Edward was out fishing with Sergeant Hastings. Sergeant Hastings is a gentleman that we house in a cabin that we own across the way from our own house. He's a a veteran of the Second War of the Revolution, you see, and quite a lovely gentleman, but is no longer able to do all of the things that he was able to do in his youth, and can't walk around as much as he could. But they do like to go fishing together, and as a horrible joke, Edward decided that he was going to put a fish under Jenny's pillow, and of course it sat there all day, and she found it at night, and it was a terrible stench. It was in the middle of summer, and she decided to tell me about it, and I told Edward that it was not a good thing to do, and that he needed to sit in the corner of his room and study the Bible, and if he were to do it again, we would put him to extra chores around the farm. So, but we are not strict disciplinarians in the fact that we do not strike our children. Is my husband in the local militia? Well, he is just aged out of the militia, but he was, and he was in Canandaigua as well. And he served in the militia in Canandaigua during the Second War of the Revolution in 1812, but was not called to active duty. But he does endeavor to perhaps run for local government. He has been in touch with folks in Noblesville to perhaps be a part of local government in the area, but it is just dreams at this point. I do not think that he's actively going to be in government at the time being, but. Well, thank you, Miss Hazard. I wouldn't say I'm a good seamstress. I put my dress together in probably about a week or so, and I also knit as well. In fact, I did bring my knitting as well, and I feel like I'm more proficient in knitting than I am in sewing. Both my daughters, Ellie and Jenny, are quite proficient sewers, and they, as well as my sister-in-law Ruth, she does quite a bit of sewing as well. But that is what is required of ladies. Most of us do not have the luxury of going to seamstresses, tailoresses, mantua makers in cities and such. I know that the Campbells do from time to time, but they're living quite a bit more comfortably than I think we are, although we do live at a good comfort, I would say. And how did I and Mr. Curtis meet? Well, my father, his name was Edward Robbins. He was a blacksmith in Canandaigua, and Mr. Curtis was looking for an apprenticeship and gained one with my father. And so when he did, of course, he would come to dinner and supper with us as well. And when he did, we got to talking, and we share similar views on religion and education and even politics. We don't talk of politics a lot out here because quite a few of the folks out here are Jacksonian Democrats, and we happen to be Whigs. But we certainly hit it off and decided that after his apprenticeship was over, after 6 years, we were to be married, and we did in 1819. And shortly thereafter, in 1820, we had Miss Jenny. So, and that's what it was like. Let's see. What is our favorite family activity or pastime? Thank you. Well, we do love to read to each other. We will get the newspaper from Mr. Whitaker's store. We will sometimes read books to one another. And of course, our Bible studies, which we do nightly. And also we have our class meeting for the Methodists in town. They meet at our house in the parlor. And that is something that we all look forward to. We look forward to conversing and meeting with our friends and having a lovely time, and drinking tea and whatnot. Of course, my children do love to play. They love to play so much that sometimes I have to yell at them to come back into the house to do their chores. But they'll go out and play hoop and stick and graces, and sometimes the boys will go fishing and whatnot with Sergeant Hastings. So it is a lovely existence. We do have quite a few happy times in our home, I do believe. Miss Timkovich, where is Ruth today? Oh, well, she's out on the farm with the children, making sure that they're doing their chores. It's a little bit of a rainy day, and so they're maybe less apt to want to complete everything in a timely manner. We've just planted our corn, and so they're set to weeding, and of course they're trying to get the cattle from one pasture to another today, and the cattle this time of the year are quite ornery due to the fact that as they say, the grass is always greener on the other side, and so sometimes they'll run to a pasture that you don't want them to. But that's what they're doing at the moment now. My sister-in-law Ruth is quite a lovely woman. She has yet to be married. She's a little older than I, but she's been instrumental in helping raise our children and also raise other folks' children around the town. She does spend a good deal of time with Lydia Hawkins' children. Mr. and Mrs. Hawkins live in town, and they have 7 children, and she helps out with them as well, teaching them sewing and knitting and a little bit of their reading, writing, and ciphering as well. So she's a wonderful woman. I hope she finds a suitor sometime in the future. Oh, Mr. Martell, my favorite book. Well, besides the Bible, of course, I do so love The Last of the Mohicans. That is a wonderful book that I read a few years past and have brought it here to the Prairie. I do read some Shakespeare as well. My favorite play from William Shakespeare is A Midsummer Night's Dream. But I do read the newspaper from time to time. I do like to keep up with events. I just heard recently that, for instance, the Republic of Texas is, or they're about to say the Republic of Texas. They just had a large skirmish, and a place called the Alamo was attacked upon, and that was big news. And there's of course the Indian Wars down in Florida that are happening at the moment, and of course the National Road is being built, and when we came to Indiana, that had not been completed, and so the roads that we traveled were quite rocky, with grand trees and stumps in the middle, large ruts with quite a bit of mud, and it was hard traveling, and that's why it took us 16 days from Cincinnati to Prairie Town. But when the National Road is built, they're going to macadamize the road, meaning that they'll pave it with large and small stones, and it will be even and easy to traverse upon. So perhaps when that happens, it might be easier for me to go back to my family in Canandaigua to visit. Oh, Miss Roan, do you like watching Shakespeare performances as well as reading them? Well, I have been to theater performances before, back in Canandaigua. Uh, I do not so approve of the way that actors live, especially since now we seem to see a lot of females becoming actors, and I don't know if I agree with that. I think promiscuous acting is quite unseemly, and I would not want my children perhaps becoming actors, but I do appreciate their performances and and what they can bring to life the wonderful plays and books that I've read for certain. And of course, we sometimes do receive itinerant actors here in Prairie Town. There were a few just last summer that came through, and they were quite entertaining. But like I said, they were a promiscuous lot with women and men together, and children even as well. So I don't see that sort of life is godly or a way to raise your children. But I do appreciate the art form that they are trying to display for certain, and I do hope that we can have some lyceums come through this way, and folks do come through on some with some lectures. For instance, we sometimes have our Methodist circuit rider, Reverend Brownfield, come through maybe just a few times a year, but when he comes, it is wonderful because all of Prairie Town will come out and watch him preach, even those folks who are not Methodists. And of course, we all hope that they will become Methodists at some point, but we are very grateful for his arrival when he comes, and sometimes his preaching will last for 2 or 3 days. We might have maybe a large group of people even camp out for the day or 3 that it might occur, and folks will bake for it, and it becomes a wonderful celebration, almost akin to the Independence Day for certain. And well, do any other folks have any questions for me? If not, I'll just continue my knitting and whatnot. Will there be a camp meeting this year? Well, we hope so. Reverend Brownfield had said that he would like to come around June. Now, that's of course if the if the cholera keeps coming around, then he might have to cancel that meeting. But so far we're quite hopeful that he will come. He usually comes in June, and perhaps if he does come, then if there are any weddings to be had, he might officiate those, which is a wonderful thing to see as well. My wedding back east in Canandaigua was quite austere compared to some of the weddings that you see here in Prairie Town. We just were married in our parlor, just in front of our immediate family by our local clergyman, but we didn't have any sort of grand ceremony outside or anything like that. But I do see some folks around here do that quite a bit, and it's a lovely thing to see as well. And folks do a lot of baking and cooking for a feast afterwards, which I find isn't a tradition I grew up with, but I am willing to accept, of course. I do so love food. Mrs. Howard, very nice to see you as well. and I hope things are well where you are. Um, I'm just working on this comforter for my son Thomas, and it's almost there. I bought the yarn at Mr. Whitaker's store. I did grow up learning how to spin, and I did spin back in Canandaigua, but we do not raise sheep on our farm out here in Indiana. But I bought some undyed yarn and then dyed it with some madder root that I purchased as well, and it came out wonderfully. I think it's a beautiful bright shade of red, which is good because then I can see Thomas from far away and making sure that he's not doing anything that he shouldn't be. But, well, perhaps I'll drink another dish of tea. Now, of course, we're getting ready for our spring planting. We've just put in our garden for the most part. We have a kitchen garden, and we grow things like carrots and turnips and onions. We've been trying leeks for the past couple of years, and most recently we've decided to experiment with the tomato, which makes a lovely catsup to go along with meat as well. When I grew up, mushroom and tomatoes catsup, mushrooms and walnut ketchup was what we had, but this tomatoes ketchup is quite nice. So we're growing those, and we grow melons and squash, and we'll put potatoes in our field, and we also grow peas and beans. So quite a lot of things that we're looking forward to having. Right now we're very fortunate that we have some greens that we can eat, both wild and what is in our garden, some lettuces and some spinach and whatnot. After a long winter, it's always very nice to have greens to go on the table. We'll boil them up, maybe with a little bit of salt pork or bacon. Have those with boiled meats or a stew of some sort. Are there any other questions folks might have? It's been very nice to talk with you all, and with that cholera going around, we haven't had as many visitors as we normally do in our home. So it's quite a nice thing to visit, especially on a dreary day like today. And I hope you've been warming up a little bit, getting nice and dry. But, and then, we're hoping that our children will come back by the end of the day and help me with supper. We already had dinner. They just went out from dinner, and we had a boiled salt beef and greens for dinner today. I'd made a dried apple pie to go along with that. And the one thing about out east that I do miss is having our own oven. Most houses out in the east have their own brick oven in their own homes, but out here it seems to be that brick is dear, and some folks like Mrs. Zimmerman down at the Golden Eagle Inn, she has a wonderful cob oven outside that we can sometimes partake in baking in, but for the most part we're baking in kettles daily rather than having our once a week baking. So it has changed my ways in the kitchen a little bit being out here, and not having as many possessions as I formerly did. We had to sell most of our possessions off to come out here, and we're slowly getting more things back, certainly. But it was quite a journey for that 33 days. But like I said, those 33 days are nothing compared to what folks had before the canals and steamboats were here. So in the earlier part of this century, certainly coming out here might take over 2 months. Oh yes, so and yeah, like I said, with our garden, we're growing all sorts of things like leeks and squash and onions. We're having tomatoes as well, but yeah, we're very grateful that we have the plot of land that we do. And when we came out to Indiana, we had only corresponded with Mr. Wainscott, the man who owned the property before we did, and we weren't quite sure what we were going to find when we got here. He owned the blacksmith shop and the house that we live in, and had described the land and whatnot, but there's always a doubt in your mind that that's not what you're going to find when you come so far from your original home. And so we were quite grateful that when we came here, everything was here as Mr. Wainscott had said, and we were able to settle in quite nicely. And our home is quite snug and comfortable. The one thing that I do wish that we had is another window in our parlor. The parlor is quite dark this time of year, of course, with the weather being as it is today. And so it would be just lovely if Mr. Curtis could perhaps put a window in the garden side of the parlor. But I've been asking, but he hasn't quite agreed to it quite yet. But I'm hopeful that will occur. Any juicy gossip from town? Well, goodness, madam, I'm not one for gossip. I don't think it's very godly to gossip. I know that some folks well, there's that Miss Whetstone, who calls herself a concerned woman, and she'll say anything to anyone, and I do not have as much of a loose tongue as she does. But I don't like to cast aspersions or talk about folks in ways that might hurt them or get back to me. And I teach my children that too, that they should not gossip. It is not kind. So I do not particularly care for that type of behavior. But, well, concerned news, it's very similar to gossiping, so I do not think that I really have any. There's always news in town. So, for instance, we have always new things coming into Mr. Whitaker's store that I'm always very happy to see, and of course the newspaper comes through, and I do appreciate that as much as anything, to be able to see things that are happening from all corners of the globe. But as I said, I am not one to gossip. Oh, let's see. What is my favorite hobby? As in what I'd like to do. Well, I do so love to knit. From time to time, I will make theorem paintings, as I did in my youth. And theorem paintings are very similar to stencils in that you might cut out little fruits and birds and such, then maybe a basket, and then stencil them all together with paint and put it on a pretty velvet so that you can put it on your wall above a mantle, and it's quite nice. I do so like that as well. and I do love to read, so I do quite a bit of that as well. Why am I sipping tea from my saucer? Well, I sip tea from my saucer because the ground or the tea leaves are loose in the pot, and if I just pour it right into my cup and drink it, well, it can get right into my teeth. Now, I know there are some folks who do that, and that is becoming the latest fashion on how to serve tea, but I find it a bit vulgar, to have big black spots in your teeth. So I pour the slops right into the slop bowl, and then I have tea in the saucer, free from the slops. So that is the traditional way for us to drink tea, and it's only become the recent fashion to drink it straight from the cup. So that's how I learned to drink tea when I was brought up in Canandaigua, New York. But I know everyone has these newfangled ways of eating and drinking. Well, for instance, I grew up, as did all of my family, eating with our knives, and we tend to eat with our knife, and the fork is merely there to hold down what you want to eat, and then you cut with your knife and eat with your knife. But there are some folks nowadays who are starting to eat with their forks, and that's becoming the fashion. There are even new forks which have extra tines on them coming from Europe. The Campbells, certainly, Dr. and Mrs. Campbell, have taken to that new fashion of eating. So there's always new things coming about that, well, we may or may not take up. I don't feel that I really need to, and if folks want to be concerned about me for some of my older habits, then let them do so. I find that my habits make sense. But, how many people live there? Oh, goodness. Well, I don't know how many people exactly in Prairie Town, but at least 100 or so. It's a small town, but it's growing every month. There are folks coming from all over, and that's one of the things I really do appreciate about Indiana, is that there are folks from Kentucky, from Pennsylvania, from New York State like myself, from New England, from Tennessee, all sorts of places that come and gather here. And so they come with their own traditions and their own ways of making food, and when we get together, we can share those ideas and share some of the thinking about those ideas, and I do appreciate that quite a bit. I find it's quite interesting, very different from where I grew up in Canandaigua, where most folks are of either English or Dutch descent, but and even that we had. We're a little different in that not everybody out here celebrates Christmas, but we came from the part of New York where there were enough Dutch people who had brought the tradition that we decided to adopt it for our own as well. But there are folks like the Gregorys from New England who do not celebrate Christmas and are quite ardently against it. But everybody has their traditions that we do appreciate of one another. Well, Mrs. Zimmerman, for instance, she's the proprietress of the Golden Eagle Inn. She has such wonderful food that comes from her German ancestry. Strudel being my favorite, of course, and she makes such a wonderful strudel. And that's something that I had not grown up with, but I have grown to appreciate. And why did I move from New York to Indiana? Well, in Canandaigua, my husband, Mr. Curtis, was unfortunately one of 9 blacksmiths, and so the field was being crowded out. But also, when his father died in 1830, his only brother, Amos, being the eldest brother, inherited the farm that they all grew up on, and so he was not going to receive any land, and he was finding difficulty establishing a business of his own. And so he had heard and seen in newspapers the West was opening up, and it was easier to get out there. So when his father died, we inherited some money, about $1,000, and we were able to start saving up to be able to come out here. And we were able to come out 3 years later in 1833. And he's the only blacksmith in town, so he has over about 100 clients, and that is really quite wonderful. He was struggling with about 25, 30 folks when we were back east. So it's been a blessing coming out here. It's been hard in some respects, but we do prosper quite well. So, oh goodness, you've moved all the way to from Indiana to Arizona. Oh, I believe that's Spanish territory. That is quite a far distance. I can only assume that you had quite a long journey to go from Indiana there, and I'm certain there are no roads or canals to go through over there. So that I do not envy your journey at all. And going further west than here has intrigued some folks. We're seeing some folks go to Illinois and westward from there, but those are unincorporated territories at that point. Or going to places like Missouri, which is a state now, but those are maybe a little bit more west than we would prefer. I think we will probably continue to stay settled here in Indiana. Miss Zimmerman, what am I knitting? I am knitting a comforter. You might call it a scarf, but we tend to call scarves fancier silken things that you might put around your neck. But this is, if you're somebody who knits, this pattern is called the Honeycomb Pattern, and it is a very simple yarn over, knit two together on one row, and then just plain knit on the second row, and you just continue the pattern, except for the edges, which are just 4 stitches of plain knit on either side. So it's fairly easy to do, and something that I learned from my mother, and she learned from hers, and all the way probably back several generations. But and how soon can you come to visit? Well, we want to be safe with the cholera outbreak that's out right now. So, I hope that hopefully soon, in a few weeks, that we'll all be able to gather together and take tea together. If when you come and you want to bring your knitting, we can knit together. And I was entertaining the idea of perhaps starting a ladies' charitable society out here. We have had benevolent and ladies' charitable societies out east, and I think a number of women might be excited to do so here, as well as perhaps a literary society where we can get together and read. And I would love to have a singing school as well, to sing hymns together, especially on Sunday for our Sunday class meeting, or for our Methodist meeting. And we do hope to raise enough funds that hopefully in a few years we'll be able to build a meeting house for our Methodist community. There are no meeting houses in Prairie Town at the moment. And so there are a lot of folks who will just end up meeting in their own homes for the time being until they can get the funds to create a meeting house. Are there any other questions? Well, it's been very, very nice to visit with all of you. It's been quite a time since I've had anybody come and visit and take tea with me. My children are due to come in soon, I hope. But we shall see. I'll hear them before they actually arrive, especially Edward and Ellie. Miss Eleanor is, well, she can be heard from miles around sometimes. And I try to tell her that that's not ladylike, but she's only 10 years old, so. But. Any other questions? Well, it's been quite wonderful talking with you all, and I hope that if you have any business with my husband, Mr. Curtis, he'll be glad to do any repairs for your farm equipment and whatnot. This is the time to get it done, especially after plowing. Some folks need to have their plows repaired or the chains repaired, oxen yokes repaired and whatnot. And so, and oxen reshod if they've lost one of their shoes, and horses reshod if they've done the same. So my husband does all that kind of work, and would be grateful to have your business if you do come along and need it. So how do we treat cholera? Well, it is a morbid disease, so it does not really have much in the way of treatment. The doctors, Dr. Campbell might bleed or purge a patient if he thinks it necessary, but it is a disease that not very many people survive from. So we might make them comfortable if we can, but there's fever and quite a bit of stomach distress and whatnot. So you might treat them with herbs from your garden. I was saying earlier, peppermint is always a good thing to have if your stomach is ill, and even ginger from the store can work for that as well. So. Well, thank you, Miss Bryan. It was very nice to share tea with you as well. Thank you very much. Well, are there any other questions that you might have? No? Well, like I said, it was quite wonderful to visit with you all, and I hope to see you soon. And we can take tea and knit together, hopefully when we can get together. So, I think I hear, yes, it is Ellie. She's yelling that the cows are out. Oh dear. Well, it looks like I've got to go then. It was very nice to see you. Got to go round up the cattle. They're out of their pasture. Well, good day all, and thank you for coming today. Bye-bye.